What's up, Tumnad lectures? In this video, we are going to be talking about intrinsic heart conduction. If you find this video helpful at the end of it all, please make sure you like the video, comment down in the comment section, and please subscribe. Let's go ahead and get started. So now in this video, we are going to go into the detail of what we call heart electrophysiology. We want to see how the heart depolarizes itself intrinsically and spreads what those kind of the action potential throughout the entire myocardium, and they cause what we call contraction. Because the heart is going to be contracting at a unit, for example, the atria are going to be contracting together, and then also the ventricles also reach time and contract together. And that coordinated kind of the manner is what we call the functional syncytium. Okay, whenever the ventricles are contracting together, and even also when the atria are also contracting together, which we call the functional syncytium. Okay, so now in this video we are going to be extracting only one cell from what we call the nodal cell, or what we call the autorhythmic conducting cell, and we also extract one cell from what we call the contractile cell, and then we see how these cells are going to be communicating to one another. At the back of your mind, I want you to know that this kind of the cell here is going to be what we call the autorhythmic conducting cell, or what we call the nodal cell. Okay, so now we are going to call this cell as what we call the nodal cell. Okay, we are calling this one as the nodal cell, and then this one here we shall baptize it a name of as a contractile cell. Okay, as a contractile cell. And the reason why we are calling it the contractile is that it's going to be having this functional unit which we call the sarcomere, which is going to be a functional unit of what we call of the muscle, differentiated from this kind of the nodal cell. Okay, so now we want to see how the depolarization of this cell will lead into the depolarization of this cell, because this cell we are calling it the nodal cell, it can spontaneously depolarize on its own without any kind of external stimulations, and that's why it has that principle of what we call automaticity. Okay, but this cell here, which we are calling the contractile cell, it needs a stimulus. Okay, it needs to be stimulated, and that's why this kind of the depolarization of this cell will also lead to the depolarization of the contractile cell. It is such another beautiful thing. So now we want to see how the depolarization of this cell will lead to the depolarization of that cell, and then finally we shall have what we call the contraction. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, now to really understand and master this kind of the concept of these two cells, you need to first understand what is called resting membrane potential. Now, the difference between the resting membrane potential between this contractile cell and this nodal cell is that this kind of the contractile cell is going to be having a stable resting membrane potential. What is resting membrane potential? Resting membrane potential is that voltage difference between the inside of the cell and then outside of the cell when the cell is at rest. Okay, and generally for the case of the contractile cell, the resting membrane potential is generally around -85 to around -90. So for this time, I'm going to be using around negative 90 millivolts. So now this is going to be the resting membrane potential for this kind of the contractile cell. Now, for the case of the nodal cell, this autorhythmic conducting cell, its resting membrane potential is not stable. Okay, as this membrane potential tries to come to the resting membrane potential, something which is very funny happens. What is that kind of the funny process which happens? Now, for the case of the resting membrane potential, I want to first take it to be approximately around -60 millivolts for right now. Because at -60 millivolts, whenever this kind of the nodal cell reaches -60 millivolts, something weird is going to be happening. But of course, you are seeing that this one, the resting membrane potential was a bit stable and it's around -90 millivolts. But if in the case of the nodal cell, we have said that it is not stable. Okay, as it approaches around -60 millivolts, something which is very funny happens. What is that funny thing which is going to be happening? We have specific type of the channels that are going to be opening whenever this kind of the membrane potential comes around -60 millivolts. You know what's going to be happening? We have this kind of these channels. These channels are so much special, and they are called the funny sodium channels. Okay, so now these channels here are what we call the funny sodium channels. okay, are what we call the funny sodium channels. Now, what happens is that when these channels opens, they are going to be starting to allow sodium to little bit trickle inside this this nodal cell. Okay, so now you're going to be having now little percentage of what we call the entry of what we call sodium ions. Okay, and these ones they are going to be entering through what we call the funny sodium channels. And the reason why the nodal cell doesn't have the resting membrane potential is just because of these funny sodium channels. As it tries to come to around negative 60 millivolts, then these funny sodium channels they start opening. Now, when they open, they are going to be moving this the membrane from the resting membrane potential to approximately around negative 55 millivolts. Okay. So now, by the opening of what you call the funny sodium channels, are going to be moving this resting membrane potential to approximately around negative 50, negative 55, around negative 55 millivolts. Now, when this membrane potential reaches around negative 55 millivolts, something else which is so much beautiful happens. You know what's going to be happening? We also have some other beautiful the channels which are going to be opening. What are these channels? You see these channels here? These channels here are so much sensitive whenever the membrane potential reaches around negative 55. These channels here are what we call the T-type calcium channels. Okay? These channels here are what we call the T-type, the T-type calcium channel. Okay, T-type calcium channel. And when we talk of T-type, it means transient. It's going to be opening for a brief moment of time. Okay, and that's what is called the T-type calcium channels. What happens when they open when the membrane reaches around negative 55, and some calcium starts entering this cell. Okay, so now you're going to be having now calcium, which is going to start entering this cell. Now, this the entry of the calcium from what we call T-type calcium channel is going to be moving this the membrane potential from negative 55 millivolts up to the threshold. Okay, it's going to be moving it up to around threshold. Okay, now the question is, what is the threshold potential for this the nodal cell? It is going to be generally around negative 40 millivolts. Okay, it's going to be generally around negative 40 millivolts. Now, when the membrane potential reaches around threshold, something very much weird is going to be happening. You know what's going to be happening? We have these beautiful the channels that are waiting to open when the threshold potential is reached for this nodal cell. You know how these channels are called? These channels here are what we call the L type. Okay, are what we call the L type calcium channels. Super very important. Now, what happens is that these the L-type calcium channels are going to be powerfully allowing the entry of what we call calcium ions. Okay, so now calcium ions are going to be now coming in a very high speed as if they have never entered before. So now we are going to be having now a lot of the calcium ions which are going to be entering this of the cell. So now, by the fact that we are having now a lot of the calcium coming inside this cell, it is going to be making the inside of the cell to even become more and more positive. It can make the inside of the cell to become more positive up to around positive 40 millivolts. Okay, it can make the inside of the cell to become electropositive to generally around positive 40 millivolts. Okay, that's going to be now the peak depolarization potential. Okay, so now when it reaches around positive 40 millivolts, that's going to be now the highest depolarization point that this cell it can reach. Now, what is going to be happening when this of the membrane potential reaches the peak point? Something beautiful is going to be happening. You know what's going to be happening? We have these beautiful of the channels. These channels here are what we call depolarization sensitive of the potassium channels. These channels are also going to be starting now to open as if they have never opened before. What happens when they open, they are going to start now allowing the out movement of what we call potassium. Okay, they're going to start allowing out movement of what we call potassium. Okay, what we call potassium. Now, as this type of the potassium starts leaking out of the cell in a very terrible kind of the speed, this one is going to be starting to make the inside of the cell to become more and more and more electronegative, meaning that the out movement of the potassium ions are making this side of the cell to become even more and more and more electronegative. Now, in the long process, it's going to be moving this kind of the membrane potential. It is going to be moving it back. Okay, it's going to be moving it back to the resting membrane potential. But now, something weird is going to be happening when the membrane potential comes back to around negative 60 millivolts. We said when the membrane potential reaches around negative 60 millivolts, some funny sodium channels open, meaning that as it reaches around negative 60 millivolts, by the influence of the funny sodium channels, this kind of membrane potential is not going to stay there. It's going to start now moving back as try to come to what we call at the threshold following the opening of what we call the type calcium channels. Okay, so now this is how this kind of the nodal cell can intrinsically depolarize itself, and then finally it can repolarize. But now we want to see during the depolarization of this nodal cell, how is the depolarization of this cell, how is it going to be leading to the depolarization of this contractile cell? Because this kind of the cell cannot depolarize on itself. It needs something to be stimulating it. What is very much beautiful is that these kind of these two cells, they have communication gates. Okay, they have communication gates that are going to be helping in the communication of one another. You know how these kind of the gates are called? These kind of the gates that are helping these cells to communicate one another. These ones are what we call the gap junctions. Okay, these kind of the gates here are what we call the gap what we call the gap junctions. These ones are super very important, and they're going to be made up of what we call protein connections. Okay, we're going to be having a lot of what we call connections that make up what we call the connections, and then on how the connections from both cells are coming together to make what we call the gap junction. So we're going to be having what we call the gap junctions, which are going to be helping in the communication between these two cells, between the nodal cell and what we call the contractile cell, meaning that for a nodal cell to communicate with a contractile cell, it means it has something has to pass through what we call the gap junctions. So now, if this kind of the contractile cell contracts, we don't want these cells to separate from one another. How do they protect them from separating from one another? We have some other kind of the structural proteins that are going to be helping to provide that kind of the adherent force, such that whenever the contractile muscle contracts, they not separate from one another. You know how these kind of the structural proteins are called that are keeping these cells together? These kind of the proteins, structural proteins, are what we call the desmosomes. Okay, they are what we call the desmosomes. They are trying to keep the contractile cell and the nodal cell together, even when the contractile cell contracts. It is such another beautiful thing. So now, when you see where you have the gap junction and you have the desmosomes, these ones together, they are what we call the intercalated discs, and that's why some of the characteristics of what we call the cardiac muscle is that they have what we call intercalated discs. And when we talk of intercalated discs, this is going to be a group of what we call the gap junctions with what we call the desmosomes. It is also such another beautiful thing. So now we're going to be having now this one as a intercalated disc, and also intercalated disc. Okay. Now, during what we call the opening of what we call L-type calcium channels, that's when we said that this cell was super electropositive, having a lot of what we call the calcium ions. What happened is that some of the calcium ions are now going to be passing through these gap junctions, and then they enter into this kind of the cell we are calling the contractile cell. What's going to be happening exactly? Some of the calcium ions are going to start now entering this side. Okay, they're going to start entering into another cell. So we're going to be having now the calcium ions, which are going now to start coming towards it. So now you're going to be having a lot of the calcium that have moved from what you call the nodal cell, and now they have come towards what you call the contractile cell. Now, whenever a cell gains what you call cations, the membrane potential has to change. Now, the question is, what is going to be the resting membrane potential of this cell? We said that the resting membrane potential of this contractile cell was around negative 90 millivolts. But when this kind of the calcium ions tickled inside this contractile cell, do you think the membrane potential of this cell is going to be remaining the same? The answer is no. It means as more calcium enters, the membrane potential is going to be moving from the resting membrane potential and it moves towards threshold. Okay? The membrane potential is going to be moving and then it moves towards the threshold. Now, once the threshold potential of this contractile cell is reached, another kind of the powerful kind of the channels are going to be opening. You know how these channels are called? These channels which are going to be opening are what we call voltage-gated sodium channels. You see these channels here? They are what we call voltage-gated sodium channels. Okay? They are what we call voltage-gated sodium channels. Super very important. These channels are going to be opening as if they have never opened before, and they allow a lot of the sodium to start trickling in at a very much terrible speed. So now inside of the cell is even becoming more and more electropositive. Now, this one is going to be moving this kind of the membrane potential towards electropositivity. Inside of the cell is becoming super electropositive. It can move this kind of a membrane potential. It moves it. How high can it go? It can generally go to approximately around positive 10. Okay, it can go generally around positive 10, and that's what we call the peak depolarization potential for this kind of the contractile cell. Okay. Now, when this kind of the membrane potential is reached, now the whole cell is fully depolarized. Now, when it reaches around positive 10 millivolts, these kind of the voltage-gated sodium channels, they are now going to start closing up. Okay, they are not going to start closing up. Now, when they start closing up, some other beautiful channels are going to be opening. You know how these channels are called? We have these beautiful channels here. They are so much sensitive to what we call depolarization. These channels here are what we call voltage-gated potassium channels. Now, when these channels open, they are now going to be allowing now the efflux. They're going to now allowing what we call the out movement of what we call potassium. Okay, so now potassium is starting to leak out by the opening of this kind of the potassium channels. Now, if you lose the potassium ions coming from inside of the cell going outside of the cell, it means the cell is going to be starting to regain some little bit of what we call electronegativity. Now, by the opening of these potassium channels, they can make this kind of the membrane potential to move slightly down to approximately around 0. Okay, to around 0 millivolts. Now, when this membrane potential moves down to around 0, this one is a very much powerful stimulus for another kind of the channels. What are these channels? You see these channels here? These channels here are what we call calcium channels. These channels here are going now to start opening, and when they open, they allow now calcium to start trickling in. Okay, so now this one, they allowing calcium to start trickling in. Now, at this moment, we are having potassium moving out, and again we are having calcium moving in, meaning that we are moving out cations and we are bringing in cations. At this point, we are not going to be having any change in the membrane potential. For that reason, we are going to be having what we call a plateau. Okay, we're going to be having what we call a plateau. Okay, it means there's no change in membrane potential. The fact that we are effluxing potassium as we are influxing the calcium ions. It is also such another beautiful thing. Now, we are having now a lot of the calcium ions. Okay, we are having a lot of calcium ions. Now, the fact that now we are having a lot of the calcium ions at this moment, something very much beautiful is going to be happening. What's that going to be happening? You see this structure here? This structure here is what we call the sarcoplasmic reticulum. He has a lot of the calcium ions inside it. But what becomes funny is that the calcium which has just entered this cell is going to be inducing the release of the calcium which is residing in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. it is something which is so much funny, but calcium is going to be inducing the release of the calcium. Okay? So now what's going to be happening? These calcium ions are going to be coming over and then they bind on a specific receptor on the membrane of what we call the sarcoplasmic reticulum. This receptor here is what we call ryanodine type 2 receptor. Okay? This receptor is what we call the ryanodine type 2 receptor. Super very important. And once this calcium binds with this ryanodine type 2 receptor, these kind of the channels are going to be now opening. Okay, and guess what's going to be coming out? We are going to be having now a lot and a lot of the calcium are going to be now coming out. Okay, so now meaning that we have now moved out calcium ions which was previously stored inside the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Now, this calcium is super very important. You know what this calcium do? These calcium ions, they're going to come over on this structure here, which we are calling the sarcomere, which is the functional unit of what we call of the muscle. This kind of the calcium is going to come over on this kind of the structure, which we call troponin. Troponin is one of the proteins that make up what we call this kind of the contractile cell. This calcium here is going to come over and then bind on what we call troponin. Because this kind of the troponin is going to be having what we call troponin I, troponin C, and even some other portions where a lot of other different substances are going to be binding. Now, what happens is that when this calcium binds on what we call troponin, it will lead into what we call the pulling away of what we call tropomyosin, which is going to be closing that site where the myosin heads are supposed to bind. Okay, and with that one happens, we are going to be now making a lot of the cross bridges. And once we make a lot of the cross bridges, the next thing is going to be what we call the power stroke. And then finally, we shall have what we call the muscle contraction. Okay, so now this is how this calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum is going to be starting over the process of what we call the muscle contraction. This kind of the process of muscle contraction is happening on entire ventricular myocardium or entire atrial myocardium, making the atrium to contract together, and even also making what we call the ventricular myocardium to contract together, which we call the functional syncytium. Okay. Now, after the contraction, we don't want these muscles to stay in a contracted state. We need them to relax. How do they relax? Now, we are going to be seeing now calcium now getting back into what we call the sarcoplasmic reticulum because the process of contraction has ended. We want this calcium away because if we keep this calcium inside this kind of the cytoplasm, it will keep on making this kind of the contractions which we don't want. We want to make this muscle to relax. How do we make it? We have said that we have specific type of the channels on what we call the sarcoplasmic reticulum that are going to be allowing the entry of the calcium back to the factory. How do we call some of these channels? This channel here is what we call the sucker pump. Okay, is what we call the sucker pump. Sarcoplasmic endoplasmic reticulum calcium, which we call the sucker pump, is going to be now allowing the entry of what we call calcium ions back into what we call the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Okay, we also even have some other mechanisms of how calcium can also leave the cell because we don't want to leave this cell in a contracted state. We have some other kind of the channels on the membrane that are going to be allowing this kind of the calcium to come out. But of course, this calcium is moving from where it is less to where it is more, meaning that it is moving against the concentration gradient. So now we need what we call protons that are going to be helping this kind of the process, and which becomes what we call the secondary active transport. So now in turn, we're going to be having what we call entry of what we call protons. So now we shall have to leak out what we call the calcium, and then with entry of what we call the protons. And even also, we also have another kind of the channel on the membrane of this kind of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which can allow the entry of what we call calcium. But now, we have a lot of the calcium inside the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and the calcium is less in what we call the cytoplasm, meaning that calcium is going to be moving against its concentration gradient. What happens, we also have another kind of the secondary active transport, which is going to be helping us in this kind of the process. How does this one happen? Some of the calcium is going to be now entering inside with exchange of what we call sodium. Okay. So now, as calcium enters, sodium is going to be leaving this kind of sarcoplasmic reticulum. So now it's going to be becoming now sodium-calcium exchanger. This is how we are going to be washing away the calcium inside the cytoplasm because we don't want the cell to stay in a contracted state. Okay? Before we go very far, we also have this beautiful kind of invagination, which we call the tubule, which also helps in the movement of this kind of depolarization to come and access what we call the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Okay, which also initiates all those different processes as we have just said. Okay. Now that we have washed away all the calcium ions, we are no longer now going to be now having any kind of the contraction. Okay, so now what's going to be happening is that these kind of the calcium channels here are also going to be closing, because if they don't close, they'll keep on tickling in more of the calcium, meaning that these kind of the calcium channels here they have to shut down. Okay, so now the fact that now they have shut down, we have ridden off of what we call calcium ions inside this cell. Now, how do we repolarize this cell? It's very, very, very simple. You see these channels here? These channels here are so much very important. These channels here, when they open, they are going to be allowing the efflux of what we call potassium ions. What's going to be happening? These channels here are what we call potassium channels. When they open, they are going to be allowing a lot of the potassium ions to start leaking out of this cell. It means that the intracellular environment of the cell is now starting to regain its electronegativity. Okay, so now we are going to be having a lot of the potassium ions are going to be moving out. Okay, a lot of the potassium going to be moving out. Now, generally, the influx of the potassium ions are going to be moving this kind of the membrane potential back to the resting membrane potential. Okay, so now you're going to be having now the membrane potential moving back to what you call resting membrane potential. Okay, so now as it reaches what you call resting membrane potential, it's going to be staying there until when some more calcium ions move from what we call the nodal cell and then they tickle into what we call the contractile cell. But it's going to be remaining constant for a little bit moment until when some calcium enters, and then to move it back into what we call the threshold potential as it waits what we call to open what we call the voltage gated sodium channels. Okay. So now that is how generally the depolarization of this nodal cell leads to what we call depolarization of what we call the contractile cell. So now this kind of the graph is going to be having different kind of the phases. This one here is what we call phase 0. And then this one here, where we had what we call the potassium efflux, is what we call phase 1. And then this one here is what we call phase 2, whereby we had the efflux of potassium with the influx of calcium, making no change in membrane potential. And then this one here is going to be what we call phase 3, whereby we are going to be having an extensive influx of what we call potassium. And then this one here is going to be our phase 4, when this kind of the membrane potential comes back to what we call to the resting membrane potential, until when there is kind of the calcium ions which are going to be coming from the nodal cell that can bring back the membrane potential back to what we call threshold. Okay, that one also makes a lot of sense. Now, something which is so much beautiful is that the depolarization of this kind of the nodal cell is dependent on what we call calcium. But the depolarization of this kind of the contractile cell is dependent on what we call sodium. That is something which is super very important to differentiate the depolarization of these two cells. Okay? And another thing is that this cell does not need any stimulus. It automatically depolarizes on its own. But this cell here, it needs a stimulus, and of course the stimulus was the movement of the calcium ion through what we call the gap junction that moved the resting membrane potential towards threshold, which leads into what we call the opening of voltage-gated sodium channels. Okay, so now all that one makes a lot of sense. Now that we have seen how this kind of the nodal cell was depolarizing intrinsically, leading to what we call the contraction of what we call the contractile cell. Now, in the next video, we're going to be looking at what we call extrinsic cardiac conduction, how the nervous system is going to be altering the functioning of what we call the nodal cell. Okay, because the nervous system can either increase the firing ability of this nodal cell, or even it can reduce the firing ability of this cell. So now in the next video, we are looking on what we call extrinsic cardiac conduction. Thank you very much for watching, and if you think whatever I've talked Is really making sense? Is adding to you? You're benefiting? Please, you can hit the like button, comment down in the comment section, and please subscribe. As always, Tumnad, until we meet next time.